Okay, here's part 2 of our introduction to social institutions, and we just talked about the definition of social institutions. Now we're going to get into the characteristics of social institutions. Sociologists are obsessed with social institutions. They're everywhere, right? Literally imagine trying to go through even just one day of your life without interacting with one or more social institutions. So they have a pretty important impact on our lives, right? Our behavior, why we do what we do. And through all that research on social institutions, we found that all institutions, I don't care if you're talking about media, government, religion, they all have 4 things in common, or 4 characteristics, right? Social institutions are generally unplanned, they're inherently conservative, they're interdependent, and they differ cross-culturally. So let's talk about what we mean by these characteristics. So the first 2, right? First, social institutions are generally unplanned, meaning they just kind of happen, which sounds odd, right? But when we think about the institution of family or government or media, it's not like there was a committee that was formed that, oh, let's create an institution of family. They just sort of happen, right? What can be confusing is we do have committees today that are trying to change social institutions, right? That we have laws trying to change the institution of education and laws trying to modify the institution of government. So that can be a little bit misleading, but they generally just sort of happen because they're responses to social needs, right? As a need arises, social institutions happen. Right? So first characteristic, they're generally unplanned. And we're going to see this especially with the institution of medicine when we get into the specifics there. Second institution, this one I think is really interesting, is that social institutions are inherently conservative. Not in the sense that they're Republican or Democratic, but in conservative in the sense is they don't like to change. They do, but it's generally really slowly, right? Hence my picture over here. So let's take the institution of marriage, for example. When people started to stand up and say, hey, we need to change the institution of marriage, we need to let same-sex couples get married, overwhelmingly the response around the country initially was heck no, right? There was a very strong resistance against same-sex marriage. And I was really interested, and as were other sociologists, in why, right? Why this knee-jerk reaction to changing this institution of marriage. And it's because of where social institutions come from. Right? Social institutions don't fall out of the sky, right? They don't just appear. They're a product of our culture, right? And specifically our beliefs, our values, our norms. So follow me here. These things are also the ingredients of our social selves. Remember that thing that makes us us, right? The collection of your beliefs, your values, your norms, right? And imagine, somebody comes up to you and says, hey, your belief is wrong or your value is wrong. Most of us do not respond by saying, wow, super glad you pointed that out. Yes, I'll change my ways. No, most of us get really defensive, right? And we dig in and, who are you to tell me I'm wrong? So going back to social institutions, when people stand up and say, hey, your social institution is wrong, individuals generally experience that as a personal attack. We feel it personally because when we hear your institution is wrong, we hear you're wrong, right? So when we think about why institutions don't like to change, it's because they're rooted in things that we hold very deeply, right? Those things that make us us, our beliefs, our values, and norms. But of course, social institutions do change, right? We're seeing, for example, if you polls for millennials tend to be much more supportive of same-sex marriage than older generations, baby boomers or even Gen Xers. And how do you explain that change in attitudes about same-sex marriage? Well, of course, because culture changes, right? So as beliefs, as values, as norms change, institutions tend to change as well, right? So institutions don't like to change, but they do. Right? So unplanned, conservative. Another characteristic of social institutions, again, it doesn't matter which one we're talking about, is that social institutions are interdependent. And we've met this before with structural functionalism, right? Interdependent, the idea that social institutions are all tangled up in one another, right? It's not like government exists over there and family exists over there. They're all tangled up in the sense that if you mess with one, it's probably going to have an impact on the other, right? A change in one brings about changes in others. And as an example of that, I wanted to talk about the U.S. government's propaganda campaign during World War II. right? So the United States gets involved in World War II, and we essentially send our labor force, our paid labor force, overseas, right, to enlist in the military, and that leaves the government with a big problem, right? All of a sudden, they have no labor force. Who's gonna, make our planes? Who's gonna make our products? Who's gonna do the work? So the U.S. government has this aha moment of, oh, there's all these white middle class women at home doing, quote, nothing. Let's get them into the workforce to take up those spots that men left behind when they enrolled. So here we have an example of the institution of government being totally tangled up in the institution of family, one having a very direct impact on the other. And this propaganda campaign was very successful, right? And notice it was specifically targeted towards white middle class women, right? Minority women, poor women had pretty much always been in the workforce. So this was very much intended to get white middle class women into the workforce. And I wanted to just show you a quick clip of some of the propaganda that was used to get them there.
She's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage. Sitting up there on the fuselage. That little Fred can do more than a male can do. Rosie, the riveter. Rosie's got a boyfriend, Charlie. Charlie, he's a Marine. Rosie is protecting Charlie. Working overtime on the riveting machine. When they gave her a production.
Okay, you get the idea. And what I wanted to point out there, besides that ridiculous song, was that these women were being recruited not for simply, behind the desk jobs. These were very highly skilled, highly paid technical jobs. And I bring that up because, of course, when World War II is over, the U.S. government has a new problem, right? That they have these men coming home and they're wanting their jobs back. So this is when the U.S. government went to these women and said, now, if you want to support your country, you will give up your jobs and go back into the kitchen. And you can imagine how many women responded to that, right? They were really reluctant to give up these jobs for all sorts of reasons. One, of course, was the money, but probably even more important was this sense of identity, autonomy, right? Pride in their work. So I mention that because this U.S. government propaganda campaign is largely credited with starting the feminist women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. So, right, an interesting example of social institutions being interdependent, all tangled up in one another. Okay, last characteristic of social institutions, and this one's a little bit misleading, is that they differ cross-culturally. Right? So when I say they differ cross-culturally, I don't mean that all societies have different social institutions. In fact, quite the opposite. All societies have the exact same social institutions, right? If you go back to our list of society's basic needs, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the United States, a small society in the Amazon basin somewhere, every society has these same basic needs. So when I say they differ cross-culturally, what I mean is all societies have the institution of government. All societies have the institution of religion. All societies have the institution of family. What's different is what those institutions look like. So for example, the institution of government. Every society has some version of government, but of course it looks really different, right? Here in the United States, a democracy, a monarchy, communism, right? Pick your version. But they all have different, all their institutions look different because, again, remember, all institutions are based on culture. So as societies have different cultures, their institutions are going to look different. Or for example, family. Every society on the planet has the institution of family, but what family looks like is really different. So we have, for example, in the US, this sort of stereotypical ideal mom, dad, 2.5 kids family, but that's not true in all cultures. For example, in rural China, you would have a mom, a dad, a son, and probably the son's parents living with you. That would be the ideal family form. Or an interesting tidbit, if you look historically and at the archaeological records, the most culturally preferred family form in all of human history was polygamy, right? One husband, many wives. So it totally depends on the culture of that society. So again, when I say institutions differ cross-culturally, I mean that they're the same institutions everywhere, they just look differently depending on the culture of that society. Okay, We did it. So now what I need you to do is to go onto Canvas and do check-in number 6, right? Do those little 5-question quiz. Of course, you're welcome to pause your quiz and refer back to these 2 presentations at any time. And make sure you finish this quiz on Canvas before we meet the week after spring break. All right, thanks for sticking with me.